When most Star Wars fans think of cloners, they probably think first of the Kaminoans, the creators of the Republic's clone army. The Kaminoans are certainly the most prominent cloners in Star Wars media, and the Clone Wars made them the most historically significant cloners in universe too. But the Kaminoans didn't have a monopoly on cloning, and they actually didn't even have the largest share of the galaxy's cloning industry. That title belonged to the Arkanians, whose cloning methods were inferior to the Kaminoans, but far cheaper and thus more popular. The Arkanians were similar to the Kaminoans in many respects, and not in a good way. They were the galaxy's resident mad scientists, known for being immoral and responsible for some truly unspeakable crimes. In this video, we'll be taking a close look at the Arkanians, their history, and why the Republic's clones were actually lucky that they were made by the Kaminoans.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Arkanians hailed from the planet Arkania in the Parave system, which was located in the colonies, one of the inner regions of the galaxy. Specifically, Arkania lay between the Polemian trade route and the Hydian Way, two of the galaxy's most important hyperspace routes in the heart of the northern dependencies, a fairly well-off region with a long history under Republic rule. On a galactic scale, Arkania wasn't far from Coruscant itself, and this, combined with the fact that they were one of the first civilizations to join the Republic after its founding, made the Arkanians very prominent in galactic politics. Arkania was a terrestrial planet with no moons and standard gravity that orbited the white star Olim. The Arkanian year was 277 local days, and said local days lasted only 18 hours. Arkania was a habitable planet, but by most species standards, it wasn't a pleasant one. Arkania's surface was dominated by tundra and glacier-strewn mountains, and its climate was frigid year-round, from the poles to the equator. Ice, snow, and permafrost covered most of the planet's surface. But beneath this frigid outer layer, Arkania's crust was blessed with extensive mineral resources, including massive loads of diamonds. After making contact with the Republic between 25,000 and 24,000 BBY, the Arkanians began mining and exporting these diamonds, and they reaped enormous profits doing so, allowing them to develop Arkania into a galactic power player. For as long as anyone could remember, the Arkanians lived on Arkania, but some sources claim that it actually wasn't their original homeworld, and that the Arkanians had migrated to Arkania from their original homeworld in the distant past. But even if this was the case, Arkania had long since become their homeworld, and the Arkanians had adapted to its harsh conditions quite well. Much like the Kaminoans, the Arkanians considered themselves the pinnacle of evolution, and while that says a lot more about their culture than their biology, they were, at the least, fairly well adapted to their chosen home. Arkanians were near humans, and most of them could easily be mistaken for humans from a distance. But there were a few traits that made Arkanians stand out. They had 4 digits on each hand instead of 5, all tipped with claws, and their skin tended to be paler than most humans. Arkanians all had white hair, and their eyes lacked pupils, appearing bright white and featureless. These eyes could see well into the infrared spectrum, allowing Arkanians to see in the dark and detect sources of extreme heat. This was very useful on dark and frigid Arkania, although it meant that some Arkanians had to wear infrared blinders on planets with younger, hotter suns. Arkanians also tended to live slightly longer than the average human, and almost all of them were extremely intelligent. With all that said, there was a lot of variation within the Arkanian species, mostly because they subjected themselves to genetic manipulation. This was something they had in common with their rivals in the cloning industry, the Kaminoans. But while the Kaminoans altered their genome in pursuit of perfection through uniformity, the Arkanians sought genetic perfection through experimentation. Some Arkanians performed genetic experiments on themselves, and most subjected themselves to some form of gene alteration or cybernetic enhancement to improve their capabilities. The Arkanians didn't have the same unified understanding of what genetic perfection meant, unlike the Kaminoans, and so their genetic experiments caused them to diversify into a number of subspecies, some with radically different traits from baseline Arkanians. While the Arkanians created offshoots by mixing their genome with those of many other species, the most prominent Arkanian offshoots were part Arkanian, part human. Part human Arkanian offshoots had 5-fingered hands, human-like eyes, and stark white skin. These offshoots had been bred to be tougher than baseline Arkanians, since they were intended to serve as a manual labor caste, although they were much more vulnerable to Arkanian diseases, even ones that were very mild for ordinary Arkanians. Despite their incessant genetic tinkering with their own species, however, the Arkanians were socially stratified according to standards of genetic purity, with baseline Arkanians at the top and divergent Arkanians lower down. The offshoots were seen as inferior and treated as second-class citizens, and at various points in Arkania's history, the Arkadian ruling class idly considered sadistic and genocidal answers to what they called the offshoot question. The Arkanians were stereotyped across the galaxy as immoral, mad scientists, and this stereotype was often accurate. Arkanian culture heavily emphasized education and research to the point that nearly all Arkanians were academically inclined in one way or another. Scientists were held in the highest esteem on Arkania, and Arkanian scientists were considered to be the best in the galaxy, even by many non-Arkanians. The scientists' dedication to their projects was legendary. They would sometimes work on initiatives over the course of generations, spending centuries total on research, development, and implementation. Arkania's enormous wealth allowed them to keep their scientists well funded, and this, combined with Arkanian scientists' dedication and confidence, meant that Arkania's science community was usually far ahead of most of their rivals. Unlike the Kaminoans, who focused near exclusively on genetics and biology, Arkania's scientific community was fairly diverse. While geneticists and biologists predominated, Arkanians were also known for their highly advanced weapons and other forms of high technology, as well as for their medical technology and doctors. In fact, the Arkanians were responsible for many of the galaxy's most important leaps in medical and cybernetic technology, and much of their other research contributed immensely to the well-being of the average Republic citizen. But with that said, the Arkanians were most well known for their work in genetic manipulation for a reason. They were fascinated by genetics, particularly the genetic makeup of other species. This started as innocent curiosity, one that drove the Arkanians to become prolific explorers in the hopes of encountering new species to study. But the Arkanians did more than study genetics, of course, and they engaged in genetic manipulation without any regard for morality or consequences. This led to the Arkanians creating new species, inventing cruel but efficient cloning processes, and inventing castes of slave laborers, among many other things. As you can probably tell by now, the Arkanians didn't exactly have the healthiest culture or society in the galaxy. Indeed, many outsiders considered Arkanian culture's defining trait to be a deeply ingrained arrogance, a byproduct of their belief that they were the pinnacle of evolution. This arrogance bred entitlement, making the Arkanians believe that they had the right to experiment on what they considered to be lesser species just because they could. Even many of those Arkanians that didn't think themselves superior to non-Arkanians still believed that Arkanians were inherently the most intelligent beings in the galaxy, and they tended to be excessively confident in their own abilities. The Arkanians' supremacist outlook meant that visitors to the planet had to be careful to prove themselves worthy of the Arkanians' respect. An outsider on the planet that offended an Arkanian and didn't immediately make amends would be ostracized. The offended party would usually drag their name through the mud, and if the offender still refused to apologize, they would sometimes even get locked up or barred from leaving Arkania. Those in this situation could make amends with a gift and a display of humility, but if these were seen as insufficient by the offended Arkanian, the attempt could sometimes make things even worse. The Arkanians applied this whole culture of apology exclusively to offworlders. They themselves could often be abrasive, condescending, and uncaring, especially to non-Arkanians. But as with any other species, the Arkanians weren't a monolith. Many of them felt shame or at least embarrassment for their people's past atrocities, and many of them rejected their society's arrogant, supremacist ways. While many of the most famous Arkanians were heartless, mad scientists, others were conscientious beings that rejected their society's amorality and did tremendous good in the galaxy. The more conscientious sect of the Arkanian population had a long history of collaboration with the Republic and the Jedi Order, and Arkanians helped the galaxy through some of its darkest hours. Many Arkanians became Jedi, and Arkanian Jedi completely bucked the trends most others of their species exhibited, with the Arkanian Jedi Master Arkajeth ranking among some of the most honored and legendary members of the Order. As the existence of these dissenters illustrates, all the negative attributes of Arkanian culture weren't inherent to the Arkanians, but rather were just socially reinforced. For the most part, these flaws were proliferated and reinforced by Arkania's society, which was run by the Arkanian Dominion. The Arkanian Dominion was an ostensibly meritocratic corporatocracy, essentially a conglomerate of Arkania's most powerful corporations that managed the planet. Everything from the Arkanian superiority complex to the atrocities they perpetuated could be traced back to the philosophy of the Arkanian Dominion, which Arkanian society was thoroughly saturated with after tens of millennia of Dominion rule. The Arkanian Dominion believed that profit and progress were what mattered most, and that virtually everything else could be put aside in pursuit of those goals, morality and the well-being of others included. This was the source of the Arkanians' scientific ruthlessness. Arkanian corporations and the Arkanian Dominion demanded results and trained their scientists to seek them out without any regard for morality or consequence. The result was some of the worst atrocities the galaxy had ever seen. Arkanian society was also very heavily urbanized, since the unpleasant conditions of their homeworld's frozen wastes meant that most of the planet's inhabitants preferred to live in Arkania's comfortable, climate-controlled cities. These were usually fully enclosed and designed to keep the cold out, ensuring that visitors to Arkania and the Arkanians themselves didn't have to worry about the planet's harsh conditions. The only ones that lived out in Arkania's extremes, for the most part, were the Arkanian offshoots. The offshoots were forced to live in poorly constructed camps on the outskirts of the planet's cities, typically the remnants of old mining camps, where the offshoots were kept segregated from the mainstream Arkanian population. The Arkanian cities were scattered across the planet, and the most prominent of them were built around the planet's spaceports, including Campi, Novania, Trade City, and the planetary capital, Adaskopolis. Located in the planet's snow-capped mountain, Adaskopolis was not only Arkania's political capital, but also its commercial and financial hub, home to Arkania's most advanced bioengineering labs, arms manufacturing plants, and Adaskopolis' financial exchange. Adaskopolis was named for, and largely ruled by, the House of Adaska, an Arkanian noble house with considerable influence over the Arkanian Dominion. The House of Adaska also ran Adascorp, or more formally, the Adaska Biomechanical Corporation of Arkania, one of the planet's biggest industrial titans. Adascorp was primarily focused on bioengineering and medical science, but it also dabbled in military technology, mining, and banking. During the Mandalorian Wars, Adascorp was one of the most powerful corporations in the galaxy, and it worked extensively with Zerk Corporation, the galaxy's largest monopoly at the time. During the wars, Adascorp was run by Lord Arko Adaska from the starship Arkanian Legacy, under whom the corporation all but took over the Arkanian Dominion. After Adaska was killed during the Mandalorian Wars, however, Adascorp lost much of its power, though it continued to exist. There were many other powerful Arkanian corporations as well, among them a great many clone manufacturers. The most prominent of these was Arkanian Microtechnologies, which marketed itself as a producer of medical supplies and technology, but which focused on research and development of genetic engineering and cloning methods. Arkanian Micro experimented with all manner of genetic manipulation techniques, from gene editing to forcing mutation via massive radiation doses, and they were also among the galaxy's most prominent suppliers of clones. The Arkanian clone masters were ruthless and entirely amoral, the most extreme examples of the Arkanian science community's flaws. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, the primary source of the planet's wealth was its diamond mines. These mines were scattered all across the planet. Some were located right outside the major cities, while others were deep in the wastes. Generally staffed by second-class Arkanian offshoots and non-Arkanian laborers, these mines were quite hazardous, but they were nonetheless reliable sources of diamonds and other raw materials. All told, Arkania was a powerhouse in galactic trade, exporting raw minerals, precious metals, diamonds, medical supplies, and many kinds of high technology, clones, biological weapons, and even Sith artifacts at one point. During the old Sith Wars, many bounty hunters and mercenaries used Arkanian bond armor, inertial inhibitors, and personal energy shields, and some even used the blinders the Arkanians made to filter out excess infrared light for protection against electromagnetic energy. Arkanian weapons were also very popular around this time, most notably Arkanian blaster pistols, heavy blasters, sonic blasters, blaster rifles, and sonic rifles. Arkanian heavy blasters were especially popular as they provided superior firepower in a compact package. Across the board, Arkanian technology had a reputation for being ahead of its time. During the Jedi Civil War, the most popular Arkanian blasters and energy shield models were over 2,000 years old, but they still performed better than many modern equivalents, even if they were typically incompatible with modern upgrades. Arkanian blasters and armor of that era tended to feature pale gold finishes, making them stand out from the products of other arms dealers. On the whole, Arkania exported more than it imported, but it did have a few major imports as well, most prominently luxury goods, financial assets, and information. While most visitors to the planet arrived at surface spaceports located within the planet's cities, these spaceports generally catered to passenger craft, and shipping was instead based out of a series of orbital space stations that functioned as commercial spaceports. These included Kazeb Mining Operations Center, which oversaw the exporting of diamonds, metals, and other raw materials, as well as Parave System Starport and Arkania Hyperspace. Arkania was also orbited by Arkania Command, a military space station that served as a command outpost for the Republic Navy. In the grand scheme of things, clones were a fairly minor product of the Arkanians, but in the world of cloning, the Arkanians were still major power players, primarily because they were the ones who had invented the most widely used cloning methods. The so-called Arkanian method differed greatly from the competing Kaminoan method, which you're probably more familiar with. While the Kaminoan method was slow, careful, and perfectionist, the Arkanian method was much faster, much more efficient, and much more concerned with quantity than quality. The Arkanian method began the same as the Kaminoan one. Cloners would take a cell from the template, extract their genetic code, implant that code into a donor cell, and then gestate these cells in nutrient jars. Specific nutrient mixes would then be used to speed up aging, allowing clones to be grown to maturity relatively quickly. The Kaminoans typically doubled the aging rate, speeding up the process, but giving the clones plenty of time to be put through extensive natural training. The Arkanians, and most others however, would accelerate aging much more, growing their clones to adult maturity in as little as a year. Of course, this left little time for training, and the Arkanian solution to this was what they called flash training. Flash training used holograms to implant instructional images in the brains of clones while they developed, giving them a basic understanding of whatever the cloners wanted them to understand. The Kaminoans also used flash training, but only in conjunction with other training methods, whereas the Arkanians used it to program their clones with everything they needed to know, from language to combat techniques. This form of training typically produced inferior results relative to more ordinary methods. Clones had a hard time learning complex tasks through flash training, and flash training could only impart knowledge, not skill or understanding. To remedy this, the Arkanians sometimes subjected their clones to memory imprinting as well. This involved the cloners taking detailed brain scans of their templates and then downloading the brain patterns they received onto clones, which allowed them to bring their product up to speed in a matter of weeks. In theory, this would impart skill and understanding as well as knowledge, but in practice, it also tended to cause mental instability. In particular, memory imprinting increased the risks of a condition known as clone madness, which clones of any type could develop, sometimes without any obvious catalyst. Regardless of the cause, the effects were the same. Clones suffering from clone madness experienced severe identity crises that devolved into violent psychosis. Clone madness almost always ended with the afflicted clone either committing suicide or getting themselves killed. The causes of clone madness were unknown. Some speculated that it was caused by clones taking in too much information at once, while the Jedi believed it had to do with the clones' presence in the Force. As the theory went, clones that were unable to fully develop their own identities represented a sort of double presence in the Force, a shadow of their template rather than a person in their own right, and things that caused clones to be able to perceive this drove them insane. After the Battle of Endor, Grand Admiral Thrawn oversaw an improvement to the Arkanian method that seemed to lend some credibility to the Jedi's theory. By using Force-resistant Isalamiri lizards to shield clones from the Force during the gestation process, Thrawn was able to grow adult clones in 15 to 20 days without any hints of clone madness. The nature of the condition aside, Arkanian clones seemed far more likely to develop clone madness than Kaminoan ones, although there were still cases of clone madness among Kaminoan clones. This seems to have mostly come down to the difference in growth time. The more clones had their growth sped up, the greater the risk of clone madness became. Because of this, while the Arkanians could produce adult clones in a matter of weeks if they really wanted to, they refused to grow them in less than a year, and they recommended their clients go for 3 to 5 years of growth time. Generally speaking, Arkanian clones tended to perform worse than Kaminoan clones. They were less skilled, they aged and died faster, and they were less creative and independent, and they tended to be more unstable. Arkanian clones were essentially living droids and little more, but they were much cheaper and could be produced much more quickly, so most clients favored Arkanian clones over Kaminoan ones, especially those who essentially just wanted living droids anyway. As a consequence, Arkanian cloning methods predominated in the Star Wars galaxy, and they were used extensively by cloners of other species as well as the Arkanians themselves. The Arkanians joined the Galactic Republic sometime between 25,000 and 24,000 BBY, becoming one of the first major non-human species to join the fledgling government. At this time, the Arkanian Dominion already ruled Arkania, and after first contact between the Arkanians and Republic scouts, it saw great opportunity in trade with the outside galaxy. After learning that Arkania's abundant diamonds were sought after on other worlds, the Arkanians began mining and exporting them, quickly transforming Arkania from a frontier world in the northern dependencies into a wealthy and highly developed hub of trade. The Republic and the Arkanian Dominion established trade cities all across the planet to support the diamond trade, and Arkania experienced a lengthy economic boom. They used this early boom to support their scientific endeavors, and before long, Arkania's scientific and medical innovations took over from the diamond trade as the planet's main industry. As Arkania grew in economic power, the Arkanian Dominion quickly accrued a great amount of political power as well. The Arkanians became one of the most prominent species in the Republic, playing a decisive role in many of its wars. During the Alsakan conflicts, Arkania was a staunch ally of Alsakan, while during most of the Republic's other wars, its scientists worked closely with the Republic military. Throughout Republic history, however, the Arkanians' reputation was tainted by numerous scandals, many of them brought on by unethical experiments on other species. In 17,000 BBY, for example, Arkanian scientists working out past the end of the Plemian trade route discovered and experimented on the 4-armed Zexto of Troikan. Their experiments resulted in the creation of an entirely new species. the Kaminoans, which you might know as Yarl Poof's species. The Arkanians eventually abandoned these experiments, fearing Republic sanctions should they be discovered. After all, the reason they'd started experiments so deep in the Outer Rim was because the Senate had outlawed these sorts of genetic experiments after the Arkanians attempted them back home. Of course, once the Republic made contact with the Kaminoans and the Zexto millennia later, the truth came out, although the Arkanians were never punished. The Kaminoans, for their part, didn't care all that much, although the Zexto were much less happy about the whole affair, having denied the Kaminoans were related to them for years before proof came out. As we mentioned earlier, other Arkanian experiments led to the creation of the Arkanian offshoots, who were pressed into service as manual laborers across Arkania. The creation of the offshoots was eventually recognized by mainstream Arkanian society as a horrible crime, but not for the right reasons. Rather, the Arkanians became ashamed of how their ancestors had messed with their own genetics rather than how they had attempted to create a slave race, and many pure-blood Arkanians believed that the solution to the problem their ancestors had created was genocide. Such views were especially prominent among the House of Adaska, which repeatedly tasked Adas Corp with secretly engineering and releasing plagues meant to wipe out the Arkanian offshoot population. The Arkanians achieved the height of their power and prominence in the galaxy during the Old Sith Wars, particularly around the time of the Mandalorian Wars. Part of this prominence was due to ties with the Sith and the Jedi. During the time of the original Sith Empire, prior to the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, the Sith actually had a secret stronghold on Arkania, the Great Sith Library, Vishas Tuan. It's unclear how this was even possible, given how deep Arkania was in Republic space and how isolated the Sith Empire was at the time, but most sources indicate that the library was extremely secretive and known only to the Lords of the Sith. Regardless, Vishas Tuan was an enormous complex hidden deep in Arkania's snowy wastes, primarily built underground. It was 5 square kilometers in size and built like a labyrinth, and it housed the Sith Empire's largest collection of records, scrolls, holocrons, and artifacts, as well as temple facilities and sealed chambers where Sith sorcerers could conduct experiments. The place was so huge and maze-like that even the most competent Sith Lords tended to get lost in it, and most found it near impossible to find whatever they came to Vishas Tuan for. However, Vishas Tuan's time didn't last. The Jedi learned that it was located on Arkania during the Great Hyperspace War, and they promptly dispatched a strike team to destroy it. The Jedi successfully drove the Sith from Arkania, and they completely destroyed Vishas Tuan, as well as most of its contents. Only a few artifacts and holocrons were taken by the Jedi for study, as the Jedi wanted to destroy as much of the Sith's teachings as possible to prevent a Sith resurgence in the future. Some later Sith historians considered the destruction of Vishas Tuan to be the single greatest blow ever dealt to the Sith. After the purging of Sith influence from Arkania, the Jedi set up shop on the planet, hoping to insulate it from the return of dark side influences. Circa 4000 BBY, one of the most prominent Jedi Masters in the Order, Arkajeth, established a small Jedi praexium on Arkania, where he began training apprentices in the ways of the Jedi. Arka himself was an Arkanian offshoot, and he had played a role in a number of high-profile Jedi operations, including the defeat of the Laurel Raiders and the end of the Great Droid Revolution. Master Arka built his training academy deep in Arkania's wilderness, far from any of its diamond mines, near the outskirts of one of the planet's smallest spaceports. The praexium was small, designed to host up to 20 students at a time, but many prominent Jedi were trained there over the years, among them Krindar Hulis, Barrison Dre, Tot Donita, and Ulik and Kay Kildroma. In 4000 BBY, Arkajeth and his apprentices temporarily relocated to Onderon to resolve the Beast Wars there, but Master Arka's praexium on Arkania remained in operation, and it even stuck around for a few decades, following Arka's death on the eve of the Great Sith War. By the start of the Mandalorian Wars, the presence of this Jedi praexium, as well as Arkania's enormous industrial and scientific importance in the Republic, brought the Arkanians to the height of their power. At the time, the planet was effectively ruled by Lord Arko Adaska, who made Arkania into a major Republic military stronghold. But as the Mandalorians began beating the Republic badly, Adaska began playing both sides, offering to sell weaponized space slugs to the highest bidder. This scheme went sideways, however, when one of Adaska's mistreated Arkanian offshoot servants turned the space slugs on Adaska's own ship, the Arkanian Legacy, destroying it and killing Lord Adaska in the process. This was a significant blow to Adis Corp, though not necessarily for Arkania as a whole. Arkania remained a prominent Republic stronghold throughout the rest of the Mandalorian Wars and into the Jedi Civil War, supplying Republic forces with blasters, personal energy shields, and medical equipment. Arkania became less prominent in later wars with the Sith, but it remained a staunch supporter of the Republic through all of them, even through the Republic's Dark Age at the end of the new Sith Wars. During the Great Peace of the Republic, the Arkanians continued to rank among the galaxy's most prominent scientists, and they also continued their long history of unethical experiments on other species. In 490 BBY, this led to the Arkanian Dominion authorizing its researchers to begin conducting experiments on one of the Arkanians' neighbor species, the Yucca. The Yucca were an unintelligent species, and the Arkanians considered them barely sentient. To that end, Arkanian Dominion scientists had the Yucca's brains almost entirely replaced with cybernetics, attempting to make them much more intelligent. The experiments were successful. The cybernetically enhanced Yucca became some of the most intelligent beings in the galaxy, but this came at a cost, as the enhanced Yucca lost the ability to feel emotion. The cybernetically enhanced Yucca took over their society, and they began upgrading their children at birth of their own accord, wanting their offspring to be like them. Over the course of centuries, all Yucca became cybernetically enhanced, and the species was permanently transformed. Many in the galaxy saw this as an act of genocide. The Arkanians had essentially eradicated the original Yucca culture, redesigning the species according to their own designs. The new Yucca might have been smarter, but this came at the cost of emotional lobotomization, and it also gave them a dark and sometimes cruel sense of humor, born of boredom and a lack of empathy. The Arkanian Dominion had utterly destroyed a peaceful people and replaced them with a society of brilliant sociopaths, and some historians considered this the worst atrocity in Arkanian history, which was saying something considering what came after. Many Arkanians were among those who objected to the experiments on the Yucca, and over the course of these experiments, this led to a steady rise in unrest on Arkania itself. Those who opposed the experiments repeatedly petitioned the government to stop them, but the Arkanian Dominion proved entirely unaccountable. Eventually, the objectors gathered together under the banner of the Arkanian Renegades. The Renegades made one last petition to stop the experiments on the Yucca in 50 BBY, and when the Arkanian Dominion refused, the Renegades attempted to overthrow the government, beginning the Arkanian Revolution. The Arkanian Renegades began the revolution with noble goals. They planned to overthrow the Arkanian Dominion, set themselves up in its place, and put an end to its unethical practices. As the revolution wore on, however, the Renegades consistently found themselves at a disadvantage, and their scientists ended up turning to the same sorts of horrible genetic experiments they had set out to stop in order to get an edge. They created an army of cyborg warriors known as the Assimilators, made using all sorts of obscure and highly illegal techniques, which were made of a patchwork of droid components and alien body parts. The Assimilators were meant to be living weapons, and they were instilled with bloodthirsty, warlike personalities. Since their biomechanical nerve centers were decentralized, Assimilators were able to replace any part of their bodies with droid parts or even pieces of organic beings. They were known to repair themselves after battle by taking limbs and other body parts from the corpses of their fallen enemies, becoming walking ships of Theoses that were nearly impossible to stop. The infamous assimilator, Gorm the Dissolver, for example, was known to assimilate the limbs of his fallen enemies as grisly trophies. The Renegades' army of assimilators massacred the Arkanian Dominion's forces and supporters, giving the Renegades the upper hand in the revolution. In the process, however, the Renegades lost sight of their original mission, and they now only cared about exacting revenge on their political rivals. The bloodthirsty assimilators were all too happy to do this for them, slaughtering civilians by the thousands in their campaigns against the Arkanian Dominion. In response, the Dominion deployed its own horrors. A group of Dominion-loyal Arkanians known as the Techno-Lords created a clone army known as the Accelerated Transgenic Heuristic Abhorrers. They did so by splicing Arkanian genetic sequences with those of a number of dangerous creatures, among them Rakghouls, Dianogas, Yaka, and Amorphians. The resultant monstrosity was 4 meters tall, incredibly strong, capable of digesting literally anything, and highly regenerative. The Abhorrer template was cloned, and the clones were all upgraded with cybernetics that greatly enhanced their intelligence. Once the army was complete, the Dominion unleashed its abhorrers against the renegades. The two sides' creations fought to a draw, and the Arkanian Revolution became a bloody stalemate. Eventually, it fell to the Republic to intervene. After the Arkanian Dominion renounced the Techno-Lords and stopped the use of the Abhorrers, the Senate sided with them, and the Jedi were sent in to bring an end to the conflict. The Jedi Task Force, which included the Iron Knights and a young Mace Windu, ultimately destroyed the Assimilator army and defeated the Arkanian renegades, bringing the war to an end. The victorious Arkanian Dominion attempted to destroy the remaining Assimilators and Abhorrers, with only a few escaping Arkania, and it had the remaining Arkanian renegades executed. Following the Arkanian Revolution, Arkania more or less returned to normal. In the wake of the war, the Arkanians moved away from their experiments on the Yaka and began expanding their cloning operations, using lessons learned from the Arkanian Revolution to clone high-quality replacement limbs and organs for those in need of them. As the galaxy descended into separatist crisis, Arkania remained staunchly loyal to the Republic, and it remained a Republic bastion throughout the Clone Wars. This was despite the fact that, at the start of the conflict, the Senate outlawed all non-military cloning. Arkania was granted an exemption, but it was still prohibited from exporting its clones or cloning technology. For Arkania's clone masters, however, their loyalty to the Republic did eventually pay off. Midway through the Clone Wars, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine secretly contracted the Arkanians' top cloners to produce a second clone army to be grown via specialized Spartai cloning cylinders on one of Coruscant's moons. These clones were clones of Jango Fett, but they were created and trained according to Arkanian techniques rather than Kaminoan ones. This second army of Spartai clones was kept a closely guarded secret, and it was only deployed at the very end of the war, at the end of the Battle of Coruscant. These Spartai clones provided a massive flood of reinforcements to the Grand Army of the Republic, and they were deployed all across the Outer Rim to participate in the Republic's final offensive to crush the CIS, supplementing the thinly spread Kaminoan-grown clones. After the rise of the Empire, Arkania supported the New Order, and Arkanian scientists were frequently collaborators with Imperial military researchers. Officially, the Arkanian Dominion stayed out of the Galactic Civil War, but it was no secret that they favored the Empire. Many Arkanian scientists worked for the likes of Grand Moff Tarkin and Grand Admiral Zarin, designing advanced TIE fighters and bioweapons for use by the Imperial military. As a consequence of this collaboration, many rebels distrusted or disliked the Arkanians, and very few Arkanians joined the Rebel Alliance in turn. When the New Republic rose to power, it initially forbade Arkania from joining it over its scientists' work on Imperial bioweapons. The Arkanians, for their part, wanted nothing to do with the New Republic either, as the Arkanian Dominion was worried that the New Republic would pass strict regulations on its scientific activities. Eventually, however, tensions between the two cooled. The Arkanians helped the New Republic eradicate the Stone Mites in 24 ABY, and Arkania joined the New Republic's successor state, the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, after the Yuuzhan Vong War. So that's our look at the Arkanians, the mad scientists who even gave the Kaminoans a run for their money. But what do you think? Are there any other Star Wars species or planets you'd like us to take an in-depth look at? Make sure you let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.